Before we begin, tell me something quietly, just between us. What time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. I always read them. And if you're new here, gently, press subscribe before we start. Now close your eyes and drift with me. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the thick, sleepy quiet of sun-bleached stone. You are standing in the ancient city of Yazd, Iran. It's midday. The air shimmers, the sun is high, and there is no wind. Not out here anyway. But step inside that tall brick structure, a strange tower rising from the rooftop like a chimney turned backward, and suddenly something changes. A breeze, cool, whispering down from above. The walls are thick, the floor is shaded, the air is fresh, and that is the brilliance of a windcatcher. In Persian, they're called badgirs, literally wind grabbers, and for more than 1,000 years, they've been quietly defeating the heat of the desert using nothing but physics, clay, and clever design. But who built them? How did they work? And why did an entire civilization rely on towers to breathe? To understand, we go back, far back. The earliest examples of windcatchers appear in archaeological ruins from ancient Persia around 3,000 years ago, particularly in desert cities like Yazd, Kerman, and Kashan. These cities were not near rivers. They were not in forests. They were on the edge of deserts, hot, dry, unforgiving. But people still lived here. They built homes not with the goal of escaping the environment, but adapting to it. Unlike modern homes which rely on sealed windows and humming machines, ancient Persian architecture worked with the environment. Shade, airflow, and thermal mass were not afterthoughts. They were the design, and nothing embodied this more than the badger. At first glance, a windcatcher looks like a decorative tower, tall, rectangular, open at the top, but look closer. The top has multiple vents, usually 4, but sometimes 6 or 8. And each of these vents can be opened or closed, depending on which way the wind is blowing. The idea is surprisingly simple. Capture the wind from above and funnel it down into the rooms below. But what if there's no wind? That's where Persian ingenuity comes in. Inside the badgir is a system of vertical shafts, often connected to underground channels or canals, man-made tunnels that bring cool water from distant mountains to city homes. As hot air rises through the shaft, cooler air is pulled in from below. Sometimes water is pooled at the base of the shaft, increasing humidity and cooling through evaporation. In other words, even without wind, the badgir creates airflow, and the temperature inside, 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, cooler than the outside air, all without electricity. Yazd, one of the best preserved examples of ancient Persian urban planning, still has hundreds of windcatchers dotting its skyline. Some are small, attached to private homes. Others are massive, tall enough to tower over mosques, public baths, or caravanserais. The tallest windcatcher in Yazd rises over 33 meters above the ground, attached to the Dolatabad Garden Pavilion. You can stand beneath it even today and feel the desert air swirl gently around your shoulders. No fans, no wires, just the architecture breathing. But the story isn't just about towers. It's about the people who made them. Windcatchers weren't mass-produced or bought from merchants. They were custom-built, one for each home, each family, each angle of sun and wind. The builders, called ustads, were masters of both geometry and geology. They had to understand wind direction, elevation, thermal flow, the thickness of adobe bricks, and the needs of each client. One bad calculation, and the system failed. Too narrow a shaft, no air. Wrong direction, dust storms, Too wide, heat leaks. Back in. And so each tower was a kind of fingerprint. Unique, responsive, refined. If you lived in Yazd during the 13th century, here's what your home might be like. You'd rise before dawn to pray, the air still cool from the night. As the sun climbed, you'd retreat indoors, into rooms with thick mud brick walls and deep-set windows all shaded with cloth. The badgear would already be working, catching the morning breeze and pulling it through narrow corridors over pools or fountains into the courtyard. In the hottest months, when temperatures reached 45 degrees or more, you might sleep in the sardab, the underground chamber where the windcatcher dropped air straight down onto stone floors. You'd sit on felt rugs, maybe drink water chilled in yakchols, the ancient Persian ice houses nearby. There was no switch to flip, no hum of machinery, just quiet and breath. Some scholars argue that the badgear was one of the earliest examples of passive cooling, a technique that's only now regaining popularity in modern architecture. But in ancient Persia, it was not a novelty. It was necessity. Not everyone could afford tall towers, but even the smallest homes tried to mimic their effect, using wind tunnels, subterranean storage, shade trees, and rooftop ventilation. The goal was the same, to live in the desert without being defeated by it. Today, windcatchers are being studied by architects and engineers around the world, especially in hot climates struggling with power shortages. Universities have mapped their airflow using modern software. Conservationists are restoring towers that have stood for over 700 years, and still in Yazd, you can find old ustads, now in their 70s and 80s, who can walk you through the craft by memory alone. They will tell you which walls to thicken, which vents to open, and which months to close the shaft completely. They'll tell you which bricks breathe best, and how to balance clay, straw, lime, and time. But what they may not tell you is how many nights they spent inside those walls, listening to the wind, or how many families survived heat waves, droughts, or disease beneath the steady breath of a badgear. They may not say it, but they remember, and so does the air. So you're still here, walking the quiet alleys of Yazd. The sun is rising higher now, making the baked mud brick walls glow with the color of old parchment. And as the heat builds, the people disappear indoors, slipping behind wooden doors with iron studs, disappearing into the cool interiors that seem to defy the desert itself. But what you see towering above, the windcatchers, is just the tip of the system. To understand how they really worked, you have to look beneath the surface. Not just beneath the bricks, but beneath the culture. Because ancient Persian architecture wasn't just functional, it was philosophical. The idea was not just to live in nature, but in balance with it. And balance was everywhere. The geometry of breath to begin, you have to understand that every windcatcher was aligned not just with the direction of wind, but also with the structure of the home itself. The homes in Yazd were built around central courtyards or hayat. These were not decorative. They were the lungs of the home. Often with a shallow pool or a small fountain in the center, these courtyards cooled the air by evaporation, shaded by trees or wooden latticework. The badgear or windcatcher didn't simply pour air into rooms at random. Instead, it directed air down into the courtyard or specific rooms, depending on the season. Some badgers had multiple channels inside. Essentially, they could turn off parts of the tower and redirect air, only where needed. This was managed using wooden shutters or ceramic flaps, not high-tech, just clever. The geometry was equally thoughtful. Traditional Persian homes followed a strict sense of proportion. Rooms were rectangular, never too wide. Ceilings were domed or vaulted, not just for beauty, but to allow hot air to rise and gather above the heads of those below. Even window placement followed a pattern of modesty and shade. Windows faced the courtyard, not the street. Sunlight was welcome, but only diffused light filtered through carved wooden screens called mashrabia. This wasn't just cultural, it was thermal logic. The home was a living structure, breathing through vents, cooling through pools, adjusting through seasons. And this was all before touching a single machine, digging the earth to capture the sky, but windcatchers alone couldn't do the job. The real magic of Persian cooling systems came from what lay underground. Canals. If windcatchers were the lungs of the home, canals were the veins of the city. A canal is a sloping, hand-dug tunnel that brings groundwater from a distant mountain aquifer to the heart of a city. Imagine an underground canal stretching for kilometers, with small vertical shafts surfacing every 20-30 meters like breathing holes. These tunnels were dug at a slight downward angle to let gravity carry water gently downhill. No pumps, no pressure, no sound. And here's the genius. Windcatchers were often connected directly to canals. The airflow pulled cool air across the subterranean water, chilling it further before it rose up into the home. Sometimes the cool air passed through clay jars of water or over shallow pools, amplifying the cooling effect. Occasionally, homes had double badgers, one to suck hot air out and one to pull cool air in. This isn't myth. It's physics, and it worked. Yazid's oldest canals are more than 2,000 years old. Some still function today. Stretching over 70 kilometers, the Zarch Canal is one of the longest in the world, and they weren't dug with machines. They were dug by Moganis, master tunnelers who trained for years. Working with only picks, shovels, and oil lamps, they would dig from the base of the mountain, checking the gradient constantly, sometimes correcting by centimeters per 100 meters. A single mistake could collapse a tunnel, misjudge the slope, and the water stagnates or floods. Their reward? An invisible masterpiece, a river beneath the sand. A life lived in coolness and dust inside. The homes of Yazd, life was organized around the rhythm of heat and air. The daily routine was not unlike a tide, ebb and flow, rising and retreating. In the cooler mornings, families gathered in the open courtyard. Tea was made. Bread was baked in clay ovens called taftoons. The scent of herbs, dried mint, sumac, and dill floated on the air. By noon, the family would shift into the sardab, the cool underground chamber. Here, children might nap on stone platforms, while adults embroidered chopped herbs, or read aloud from Persian poetry. The walls were lined with thick plaster and clay. Sometimes glazed tiles cooled by air passing through, and always the air moved, quietly, predictably like breath. At sunset, the home came alive again. Music, conversation, the scent of rosewater or citrus in copper bowls. The badger never stopped working. It simply changed tempo with the day. But there was one more use of windcatchers, perhaps the most surprising. Public bathhouses or hammams used badgers not to cool but to vent steam. In these places, the air was intentionally hot and moist. But after hours of sweating and bathing, patrons would pass through ventilated corridors where air cooled by windcatchers helped bring their bodies back to balance. This wasn't just comfort, it was medicine. Ancient Persian physicians believed that imbalances of heat and moisture affected health. The body needed regulation, not extremes, and architecture was part of the prescription. What happened to the builders? We rarely think of architecture as survival, but in the deserts of Iran, that's what it was. The Ustads, those who designed windcatchers, were part scientist, part artist, part engineer. They didn't use blueprints. They used memory, instinct, dust. They learned from older masters and passed knowledge to apprentices. A certain clay only worked if baked in shade. A certain opening only worked at a certain height. By the 19th century, many Ustads had begun to vanish. Industrialization, colonial influence, and imported materials changed how buildings were made. People began using fans, then motors, then air conditioning. In Yazd, many windcatchers were sealed. Some were torn down. Others were reduced to decorative relics, but a few remained. And the skills, some hid in the minds of the elderly, others in notebooks. A few, just a few, began teaching again in the late 20th century. Today, in Yazd, you can still find a small number of craftsmen who know how to build a functioning badger from scratch. They do not work fast. They do not advertise, but they remember. So now you know the silence of a windcatcher, not just what it looked like, but what it meant. How it cooled without sound, healed without medicine, and regulated daily life through invisible currents of desert air. But every great system, no matter how elegant, eventually faces decline. And the story of Persian air conditioning is no exception. This final section brings you from the twilight of the Badgir era, through its near forgetting, and gently into the modern rediscovery, one shaped not by nostalgia but by necessity, because the 21st century has begun to ask the same question the ancients once answered. How do we live with heat, without destroying what keeps us alive? From tower to ornament, the quiet decline. By the early 20th century, everything began to change in the cities of Iran. Yazd, Kerman, Shiraz, and even desert villages started adopting modern construction methods. Cement replaced mud brick, glass replaced latticework, electric fans appeared, then came refrigeration, then air conditioners humming in hotel lobbies and private homes, imported blueprints, imported machines, imported assumptions. And the bad guys? They were still there, but slowly their purpose was forgotten. Some were sealed shut to prevent dust or insects. Others were considered old-fashioned or even ugly, relics of a poorer time. Tourists would come, take photographs of the towers rising above the skyline like chimneys, not knowing they were once the reason Yazd could even exist. The Kormur buildings that depended on natural airflow began to suffer. Ceilings that once trapped heat were now suffocating without the wind. Courtyards became redundant in the age of steel windows and rooftop water tanks. Entire homes were knocked down to make space for concrete blocks. There was no catastrophe, no invasion, no fire or flood. The windcatchers were lost to time slowly, the way paper fades under sunlight, bit by bit. Coolness replaced by current, memory replaced by convenience, survival in the sand, and yet, in a few places the Badgirs kept breathing, most notably in Yazd, a city whose compact alleys and stubborn building traditions preserved more than anyone expected. Unlike Tehran or Isfahan, Yazd's growth was slow, its materials limited, and its local pride intense. Some homes remained unchanged for centuries. Families passed them down like heirlooms, keeping the same courtyard trees, the same clay filters, the same sarda where their grandparents once napped during scorching summers. And in those homes, the windcatchers still worked. Residents reported that even on the hottest days, 45 degrees Celsius or more, the lower rooms of their homes remained tolerably cool, often between 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, without using electricity, without spending anything, just mud, geometry, and air. A few engineers, both Iranian and foreign, began to take notice. especially in the 1970s and 1980s, as global energy crises triggered new interest in passive cooling systems. Researchers from Europe, Japan, and the United States visited Yazd to study how these towers function so efficiently in one of the hottest, driest climates on Earth. One by one, forgotten principles were mapped, measurements were taken, airflow modeled, thermal gradients recorded, and what they found startled them. Numbers in the wind. Imagine a building that reduces interior temperature by 10 to 15 degrees C using no energy. One study in Yazd measured a badger connected to a qanat, with interior air cooled from 38 degrees Celsius down to 24 degrees Celsius. The system used no motors, no compressors, no filters, just wind and water and clay. Another system, measured in a larger building, showed how nighttime cooling could be stored in thick adobe walls and released slowly throughout the day, flattening temperature swings that would otherwise cripple desert life. Engineers from the University of Tehran collaborated with Western climate scientists, publishing white papers about passive ventilation, thermal mass, and evaporative cooling. These weren't fringe experiments. They were case studies in sustainable design long before the term was fashionable. Yazd became a living laboratory. The challenge wasn't to invent a new system, but to translate an old one into modern architectural language. Rebuilding what was forgotten. By the late 1990s, a quiet movement had begun. Young architects in Iran, many trained abroad, returned home with a sense of curiosity and humility. They wanted to blend modern building needs with traditional intelligence. No longer dismissing windcatchers as quaint, they saw them as climate solutions. In new buildings, schools, libraries, even some offices, they experimented with modern versions of badgers. Steel and glass were replaced with compressed earth blocks, recycled adobe, or clay-coated concrete. Some badgers were modified with sensors to open or close based on wind direction. Others included small fans, not to drive airflow, but to assist only when the wind dropped completely. The idea wasn't to copy the past blindly. It was to update it without losing its soul. In 2017, UNESCO designated the historic city of Yazd as a World Heritage Site. The nomination specifically praised its unique adaptation to desert climate, including windcatchers and qanats. And suddenly, what was once boring had become essential. Tourists now flocked to Yazd, not just for its mosques and bazaars, but to see homes that stay cool without air conditioning. Students traveled to the city to learn from craftsmen who still shape clay bricks by hand, laying them in patterns that direct air more precisely than any ducted HVAC system. It's a slow revival, but a real one. The ethics of temperature. It might seem strange to talk about ethics when describing a tower that moves air, but temperature is no longer just a comfort, it's a crisis. As global temperatures rise, as cities grow hotter, as energy demand surges for cooling systems, there is growing urgency to rethink how we cool our spaces. Badgers are not just heritage, they are alternatives. They remind us that people once cooled cities using only nature's rhythms: wind, shade, earth, and patience. They didn't rely on extraction. They built with dust and breath. And for thousands of years, it worked. Today, some of the world's hottest cities, from Dubai to Phoenix, are beginning to ask the same question ancient Yazdis asked centuries ago. How do we make life bearable without using energy we can't afford? And more surprisingly, how do we listen to the wind? Final reflections. So you've walked the rooftops of Yazd. You've seen the towers catch the air, the shafts dig deep into the aquifer, the rooms designed not just for people, but for climate. You, Now understand that comfort doesn't have to be a modern invention, that efficiency isn't always noisy, that cooling doesn't always require a compressor. Sometimes it requires listening, waiting, observing. That is the lesson of the Badgir, a lesson in humility, geometry, and wind. So next time you hear the hum of an air conditioner or feel the blast of artificial cold, remember the towers of Yazd, silent, tall, made of clay, and ask yourself, what else have we forgotten that might still save us? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a wall, not the wall of a palace or a cathedral, but the modest outer wall of a simple courtyard house in the desert city of Nishapur. It is early morning. The sun has only just climbed over the hills, but already you can feel the heat baking into the clay under your feet. And yet, when you step into the house and brush past a curtain of woven reeds into the shaded corridor, something unexpected happens. The air feels cool, not ice-cold, not artificial, but naturally tempered. It clings softly to your skin like linen that's been aired out in the shade. There is no fan, no electricity, no modern marvel humming in the corner. What you are feeling is centuries of forgotten wisdom, walls that breathe, floors that store cold, and bricks arranged not just for shelter but for survival. This is the story of those bricks, or rather, the craftsmen who made them, the men who shaped the architecture of Nishapur, with nothing but water, mud, and time, because air conditioning in ancient Persia wasn't just about windcatchers. It was also about what the buildings themselves were made of, and how they were made. The geometry of survival Nishapur sits on the edge of the Khorasan Desert in what is now northeastern Iran. In the 10th and 11th centuries, it was a thriving hub along the Silk Road, known for its turquoise ceramics, Sufi mystics, and vast bazaars. But it was also famous for something quieter, its houses. Not luxurious palaces, not military fortresses, but ordinary homes built by masons whose names we don't remember. And yet their methods were remarkable. Each home was laid out with the precision of a sundial. The walls were aligned to catch the least amount of direct sunlight in summer and the most in winter. Courtyards were sunken to create microclimates. Water channels, fed from deep underground aqueducts, ran silently beneath floor tiles. And, most importantly, the bricks themselves were special. These weren't mass-produced uniform rectangles like today's bricks. They were thick, porous, and heavy, with layers of straw and fine sand mixed into the clay to slow the transfer of heat. They were fired not in factories, but in open kilns made of the same earth they would later be used to build with. Some were even unfired, what we now call adobe, carefully shaped and sun-dried, then stacked in thick walls nearly 1 meter wide. These walls didn't resist heat. They absorbed it slowly, held it and released it only when the outside air cooled, usually at night. This is what we now call thermal mass. But the masons of Nishapur didn't have that term. They just knew it worked. Clay as climate control lets. Pause for a moment and look at one brick. It's dull red, rough to the touch. Maybe 30 centimeters wide, 10 tall. If you tap it gently, it doesn't ring like modern ceramic. It muffles the sound. Now imagine a wall made of thousands of these, not hollowed by pipes or filled with insulation, but solid, breathing slowly through capillaries of clay. By day, the wall absorbs the sun's heat without letting it reach the room inside. By night, the heat it stored radiates gently outward, but because the desert cools so quickly, the process is reversed. The walls now draw coolness from the air and hold it through the morning. No fans, no buttons, just physics baked into mud. And this wasn't just guesswork. There were formulas passed down orally, through guilds and apprenticeships. Masters of clay knew which combinations of soil, water, and straw would hold more humidity. They knew how long to leave the bricks under shade before turning. They argued over ratios, drying times, kiln placement, and the city of Nishapur, built from their labor, remained one of the most comfortable places to live in the region for nearly 400 years. The builder's calendar. The work followed the seasons. Mud wasn't mixed in winter. It would freeze. Summer was too hot for drying. Spring was best, when the earth was moist but not sodden, when laborers could work for hours without collapsing from heat stroke, and when kilns could be safely fired in the open. Each brick was made by hand. First the earth was sifted, removing pebbles and roots. Then water was poured into the pit, and workers would tread it with bare feet, mixing it into a paste. Straw was added, not randomly but in carefully weighed bundles. This wasn't for strength. It was to slow evaporation and allow gradual drying. Too fast, and the bricks would crack. The wet clay was then pressed into wooden molds, shaped with slight curves to prevent trapping air. Once molded, the bricks were placed in rows under woven reed mats, allowing airflow but shielding them from direct sunlight. They would rest this way for days, sometimes over a week, before being turned, hand-cured. Then came firing. Small village kilns were built from leftover bricks. A pit was dug, a tunnel laid, and then a mound of bricks stacked like a beehive. Fires burned underneath for hours, sometimes days. Kiln masters watched the smoke color, listening for the shift in tone that told them the inner chambers had reached the right temperature. And all of this just to build a house that stayed cool without modern tools. It sounds laborious, but to the builders of Nishapur it was just common sense. They weren't trying to build art. They were trying to build comfort, comfort that lasted generations. More than homes, public cool spaces. While most homes were built this way, public spaces had even more elaborate cooling systems. The caravanserais, roadside inns for travelers and traders, used layered clay vaults and double walls. Some included underground chambers called sardabs, often filled with clay jars of water to regulate temperature. In these cool basements, weary travelers could store food, rest, or nap during the brutal afternoon sun. Bathhouses, surprisingly, were also built with the same cooling principles. While heated in some areas, they were also designed with specific sections for rest. After a warm bath, visitors could recline in shaded domes that captured drafts of rising cool air, often scented by the mineral-rich bricks themselves. Even mosques had cooling architecture. Their massive domes and high ceilings weren't just aesthetic. They funneled rising heat upward, leaving the lower levels pleasantly cool for worshippers. Every aspect of building was intertwined with temperature and comfort. A cooling culture it's easy to romanticize these details, but for the people of Nishapur, this wasn't luxury, it was necessity. Without effective passive cooling, daily life in the summer months would have been unbearable. Infants would die of heat stroke, elders would collapse, stored food would rot, leather would crack, markets would close. So when you look at a simple mud brick, remember, it was a tool of survival. Children were taught which parts of the house stayed coolest at different hours. Women knew how to use curtains, rugs, and shutters to direct airflow. Masons designed courtyards to cast shadows at precisely the right angle based on the home's orientation. The climate didn't change, but people adapted, and they did it without wires, without fuel, without carbon. They did it with earth, with breath, and with memory. But of course, nothing stays the same forever. In the fading light of a modern city, you might walk past a crumbling wall, its surface flaking like dried skin, its color faded to a dull beige, its shadow sharp against the asphalt of a growing suburb. You might think nothing of it. Just another ruin, you say. Just mud. But if you had the right kind of eyes, or perhaps a slower kind of attention, you might pause, because that wall might have once stood in the heart of Nishapur, and it might have once cooled an entire family through scorching summers just by standing still. This section is about what happened after the height of clay knowledge in Persia, when wisdom that had been passed from hand to hand, from master mason to apprentice, began to disappear. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, subtly. As one generation forgot what the last took for granted, the story of how the desert's best architects lost their place begins, as many such stories do, with empire. The shifting sands of patronage. By the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks had taken control of large parts of Persia. Their arrival brought new tastes in architecture: grand mosques, tiled minarets, vast domes that touched the sky. It was beautiful work, no doubt, but it was no longer local. These designs called for stone and baked tile, not mud and straw. The state began to fund larger, more durable structures, symbols of power rather than practicality. Clay buildings still stood, of course. They always had, but they were no longer at the center of innovation. They were inherited, not improved. More importantly, the builders themselves changed. Under the new rule, much of the skilled local labor was restructured. Guilds were consolidated or disbanded. Apprentices were reassigned. Some masons were relocated to other cities, used for public works. Others abandoned their craft entirely, seeking steadier income in trade or bureaucracy. Without patronage, the subtle refinements of clay cooling faded. Techniques like double-curved bricks, layered adobe vaults, and subfloor ventilation channels stopped appearing. Not because they were outlawed, simply because no one was paying to preserve them, and so they slipped away. Earthquake and fire Nishapur wasn't just abandoned, it was broken. In 1153, the city was sacked by the Guz Turks. They looted the markets, tore down the bazaars, and scattered the city's population. But the real blow came later. A series of earthquakes between the 12th and 13th centuries that devastated much of northeastern Persia. Clay buildings, despite their strength, are especially vulnerable to shaking. Thick walls can crack, vaults can collapse. And in a world without seismic retrofitting, cities made of earth fall quickly when the earth itself turns against them. Entire neighborhoods crumbled. The knowledge embedded in those homes, the clever alignments, the breathing walls, the thermal mass, disintegrated with them. Then in 1221 came the Mongols. Genghis Khan's armies laid waste to Nishapur with methodical precision. The destruction was so total that few structures survived at all. And with the population decimated, the oral traditions of the builders, the songs, the rhythms, the ratios, were silenced. It wasn't just buildings that were lost. It was memory, the rise of cement fast forward a few hundred years. By the time Western powers began to influence Persian architecture in the 19th century, cement had become the preferred material for expansion. European advisors and engineers, hired to modernize Iran, promoted factory-made bricks, iron reinforcements, and mass-produced materials as signs of progress. Who needed clay, they argued, when you had concrete? Clay was old-fashioned, soft, messy, prone to decay. Cement was scientific, modern, and uniform, and in the new cities being planned, uniformity was prized above all. The new buildings were taller, sharper, cooler in appearance, but ironically hotter in practice. Their walls lacked breath. Their floors radiated stored heat instead of absorbing it. The high ceilings of traditional domes gave way to flat roofs that baked like iron sheets. To fix this, air conditioners were imported, and thus the loop closed. In chasing modernity, the built environment became hostile to its climate, and only machines could make it bearable again. A technology once solved by Earth now required fossil fuels. The fragmented remains today, fragments of this older knowledge still exist. In villages tucked into dry river valleys, in the crumbling caravansaries with cooling basements, in the clay homes that haven't yet collapsed under the weight of rain and disuse. Anthropologists who visited Khorasan in the 20th century noted how older villagers still spoke about brick seasons, times of year when mud should be harvested, when walls should be mended. But the younger generation had already moved into cement blocks and tin roofs, cheaper, faster, but sweltering in the summer. In a small museum in Tehran, you can find molds used for shaping adobe. The exhibit placard mentions nothing of thermal mass or airflow, just traditional building tools, as if their purpose had faded from memory, but in the archives there are clues. Writings by medieval geographers like Al-Muqaddasi and Nasir Khusraw describe the cool houses of Nishapur in reverent tones. They speak of homes with shaded rooms that stayed temperate all day, of floors as if cooled by snow even in July. It sounds poetic, even exaggerated, until you remember the science behind it, the porous clay, the deep walls, the orientation, the silence. A return to clay. In recent years, with the rise of climate-conscious architecture, there's been renewed interest in passive cooling. Architects from around the world are revisiting traditional Persian designs, not just windcatchers and canals, but also the humble brick experimental homes have been built using Nishapur-style vaults. Some use a mix of adobe and lime plaster to resist decay. Others have adapted the deep courtyards and shaded niches that once defined Persian home life. There is even talk of retraining masons to use these old techniques, though it's slow going. After all, you can't simply rebuild a craft that once relied on oral culture, intuition, and long apprenticeship. Still, the fact that these methods are being studied again is a quiet triumph. In the age of climate collapse, perhaps it is the boring old walls of forgotten cities that will teach us the most. But one question lingers. Even if we revive these methods, can they survive the demands of a modern world built on speed, scale, and standardization, or are we simply borrowing fragments of a deeper logic we no longer understand? When you stand inside a traditional adobe house on a hot afternoon, if you're lucky enough to find one still standing in the old quarters of Nishapur or Yazd, you notice something odd. The walls are not just walls. They breathe, they don't hum, or whisper, or do anything romantic, of course. But they regulate. They pull in the day's heat and slowly release it at night. They drink up moisture during the rare rains and hold it just long enough to balance the dry air. They're not inert. They're active, alive in the quiet way that centuries of trial and error once taught. This final section explores how these breathing walls were made, how the science of Earth architecture unfolded not from labs or universities, but from slow, hands and careful memory, and why even as this wisdom was buried it never quite disappeared. How to build a breathing wall to make an adobe wall that breathes. You begin not with clay, but with soil. Not just any soil, what the old masons called paksa. A mix of sand, silt, a bit of clay, and sometimes straw or goat hair. You had to gather it when it was neither too dry nor too wet. Ideally, the earth had just been turned, recently flooded by spring runoff or loosened after a harvest. The soil would be trampled by foot, often by a group of workers or animals, until it reached a sticky, dough-like consistency. Then it would be packed into wooden molds like large bricks and left in the sun to dry for several days. These bricks weren't fired. That was part of the genius. By skipping the kiln, the bricks retained their porosity, a critical factor for passive cooling. They absorbed humidity during the day and released it when the air cooled. When stacked, the walls were several feet thick, sometimes as wide as a man's shoulders. Inside, the rooms were designed with low arched ceilings to reduce heat buildup. Niches in the walls held water jugs or bowls of wet cloth to aid evaporation. Floors were slightly sunken to trap the cooler air. And sometimes beneath the building, a sardab, a cellar, was dug to act as a reservoir of cold. The whole system functioned like a living lung, expanding and contracting with the desert air, all without a single wire or motor. Vaults and secrets, perhaps. The most elegant structure made from adobe in Nishapur was the Karga-Higir, or vault maker's workshop. Vaults were among the most complex architectural forms to build from mud. Unlike flat roofs or simple domes, vaults required the adobe to be laid in a self-supporting spiral, each brick leaning on the one beside it. This technique, often called the Nubian or Persian vault, required no scaffolding and could be completed by just 2 or 3 men. It was also deeply geometric. Masons learned ratios by eye, measuring angles with string, calculating weight by the feel of the mix. One recorded method involved singing. Yes, singing. Elder masons taught younger ones to maintain rhythm and pressure by chanting low, repetitive syllables. The vibrations, they said, helped settle the bricks. Whether that was true or not, the practice ensured pace and precision, making the building process almost meditative. Vault makers were often the most respected artisans in a town, not because their work was flashy, but because it lasted. Some vaults even today remain perfectly intact after 400 years. It raises a quiet question. What does it mean to build something meant to outlive your own grandchildren? Whispered instructions. Much of this knowledge was never written down. You won't find blueprints for how to construct a sardab that connects seamlessly to a windcatcher. There are no treatises on how to shape a brick to curve just enough to redirect airflow. Instead, the instructions were spoken, rehearsed, memorized. In many villages, these oral teachings were passed during winter. When building paused, elders gathered the young men, sometimes around a brazier, sometimes in cold storage rooms, and recited the principles of brick harmony, of wall warmth, of the breath of dry rooms. They spoke in metaphors. They used the language of animals and seasons. A good wall was like a camel's side, they said. Thick, tough, protective, but always sweating gently beneath the sun. A well-placed vent was like the mouth of a sleeping man, open just enough to sigh, never wide, never closed. Modern engineers might scoff, but inside those metaphors lay a complex, time-tested physics. When these elders died or when their children left for cities, those metaphors disappeared. What remains today is fragments, bits of poetry, photographs, the odd intact courtyard, cool to the touch, half forgotten behind satellite dishes and modern roofs. Buried cities, cooling still in 2004. An archaeological dig near Old Nishapur uncovered what appeared to be a street of homes, partially collapsed, sunken into dust. What fascinated researchers wasn't the layout, it was the temperature. Inside the preserved chambers, the ambient heat was several degrees lower than outside. Even with no intact roofs, even after centuries underground, the walls, though decaying, still held their breath. The homes had once used a combination of windcatchers, clay vaults, and qanat-fed sardabs to maintain stable temperatures during the burning Khorasan summers. Some still had intact channels for water, others retained traces of ash, suggesting that bread ovens once operated next to these cooling systems in daily harmony. What surprised researchers even more was the presence of carbonized date pits in niches near the entrances. These were not random, they were placed deliberately. Modern theory suggests they may have been used to test airflow. If the pits stayed dry for several days, the air was circulating properly. If moisture built up, the air was too stagnant. Simple, but smart. It's moments like this that remind us, innovation doesn't always require revolution. Sometimes it requires attention. Lessons in the dust today. Some of the best universities in the world study vernacular architecture. They publish papers on passive cooling, on thermal lag, on the forgotten efficiency of mud. They run climate simulations and temperature tests. And yet in the outskirts of Nishapur, a few old homes are still lived in, not because of academic theory, but because they work. A widow in her 80s still sweeps the courtyard of her father's house. She doesn't use an air conditioner. She sits by the wall beneath a vine-covered arch, where it's 10 degrees cooler than the street. She smiles when asked about airflow. "The house knows," she says. "I don't need to." And perhaps that's the lesson buried in these walls, that before we calculated, we listened, that before we cooled with machines, we built in tune with heat, that before we demanded control, we designed for cooperation, with earth, with air, with time. And now, in a warming world filled with steel and glass and noise, maybe the most radical thing we can do is look down at the ground beneath us and ask, what if the future feels like the past? Imagine waking up in the dry heart of ancient Persia. It's not yet dawn. The sand is still cool. The sun hasn't begun to sear the horizon red. You blink in the soft blue light, step out onto a dusty ridge, and look out across a village that shouldn't exist. There's no river, no lake, not even a seasonal stream. And yet, life blooms here. Pomegranate trees shimmer with dew. The courtyard basin is full. The clay bricks are damp with the coolness of night. You wonder, how does water flow in a place like this? The answer lies beneath your feet, in tunnels dug by men who worked without sunlight, without machines, and often without even standing upright. They were called mukanis, and their job was to guide water across mountains and deserts, using only gravity, intuition, and dirt. In this section, we begin their story. The invisible river Zakanat is one of the most boring inventions in history. No ceremony, no dramatic origin myth, just a sloping tunnel carved by hand inch by inch through packed soil and fractured rock. But it was one of the most important inventions in the arid world. The earliest known qanats date back nearly 3,000 years, appearing first in what is now western Iran. At its core, a qanat is deceptively simple. It channels underground water from an uphill source, usually the base of a mountain aquifer, down to a town or village using a gentle slope. No pumps, no pipes, just patience and perfect geometry. These tunnels sometimes ran for miles. In fact, some ancient qanats stretched more than 70 kilometers, passing silently beneath plains, hills, and deserts, never rising above ground until they reached their destination, and they rarely failed. Which raises a simple question: who dug them and how. The men who vanished into holes to build a qanat, the mukani would start at the destination, not the source. Why? Because they needed to ensure that the water would actually emerge where people lived. First, a vertical shaft would be dug straight down, often dozens of feet deep. Then another shaft, slightly higher uphill. Then another, and another. These were spaced every 20 to 30 meters, forming a dotted line across the desert. From the surface, they looked like a row of shallow craters, but beneath each one, a mukani would descend by rope, carrying a lamp, a chisel, and sometimes nothing else. Working in teams, they dug sideways, connecting shaft to shaft, slowly building a gently sloped tunnel toward the water table. The slope had to be just right, too steep, and the water would erode the tunnel. Too flat, and it wouldn't flow. This required no small amount of genius. They measured gradient by pouring water and watching its behavior. They listened to the walls. They used a plumb line and sighting rod, sometimes measuring slope by watching how a lit oil lamp flickered in the tunnel's breeze. They worked in near silence, and when they died, crushed by cave-ins or overcome by bad air, their names were rarely recorded. They disappeared into the holes they had dug. Living by the vertical, every village with a qanat had its own culture of maintenance. These systems could not be ignored. Every few months, a team would descend into the tunnels to check for debris, collapse, or silt buildup. In larger towns, these caretakers became semi-sacred figures, not quite priests, but respected all the same. Children would gather around the crater mouths to hear them speak of airflow and soil moisture. Women would consult them about planting cycles, trusting the water's rhythm more than the calendar. Even taxation was measured by qanats. In certain provinces of the Persian Empire, land was taxed not by area, but by the number of qanat outlets, a property accessed. This meant that a single well-placed qanat could determine the wealth and survival of an entire district. And it wasn't only Persia. The technology spread to Arabia, Egypt, the Levant, and eventually into North Africa and Spain. Even in the oases of Western China, ancient Han engineers used similar systems, almost certainly copied from Persian techniques, but nowhere were they honored quite like in Yazd. In that city to this day, over 70 ancient qanats still trickle beneath the streets. The people walk above, sipping tea, eating dates. And below, always below, the earth carries on its quiet work. But what happens when a qanat dries up, or when the city forgets how it was made? That is where we'll pick up next. You blink under the morning light. The street is quiet. Behind you, the wind slips down an alley lined with mud brick walls, and ahead, the scent of freshly baked flatbread drifts from a distant window. But something's missing. There is no sound of flowing water, no quiet burble from a courtyard channel, no dampness in the soil, just dust and silence and cracks forming in the clay between stones. This is what happens when a city forgets its qanat. Not all at once, of course. It begins slowly. Someone neglects a cleaning. Another family diverts the water secretly for a private bathhouse. A shaft collapses in a forgotten field, and then another. Until one day, the water stops altogether, and no one quite remembers. Why? But to understand how that could happen, you need to know how delicate these systems really were. A fragile masterpiece, a qanat, may seem durable. After all, it's just a tunnel in the ground. But it was a living, breathing system. Every part of it depended on balance, slope, soil stability, airflow, pressure, temperature, and the health of the mother well, the original source at the top of the slope. If even one element was disturbed, the entire network could begin to fail. The Mukanis understood this. That's why they mapped every shaft, logged every fault line, and even timed their digging based on moon phases and humidity. They weren't just laborers. They were scientists, geomancers, and archivists. But as cities grew and rulers changed, many of those old roles were ignored. Some say the real decline began with taxation, when kings taxed the water in the later periods of the Persian empires, particularly under some Safavid and later Qajar rulers. Khanats were no longer managed collectively. They were sold, leased or taxed as private property. A noble family might control one outlet and charge villagers for use. A merchant might buy part of a tunnel and dig secret shafts to draw more water for his orchards. This privatization disrupted the flow. More water was pulled downstream than the source could sustain. Silt built up in unmaintained sections. Collapses were no longer reported, especially if they happened on someone else's part of the tunnel. Arguments broke out over invisible boundaries underground. To resolve this, some rulers tried to regulate the system. They issued decrees, restructured village councils, and even appointed official Khanat inspectors whose job was to travel from shaft to shaft, checking for sabotage or theft. But no law could replace tradition. Where once the Mukani was respected, now he was a low-paid laborer. His warnings were ignored. His apprentices grew fewer, and slowly the knowledge slipped away. You see, Khanats could not be rebuilt once forgotten, not easily. Their slopes had to be perfect, their angles exact. A misaligned shaft might bring down half a mile of tunnel. And so when the old tunnels failed, they weren't replaced, they were abandoned. The collapse beneath Yazdwan story, passed quietly between families in Yazd, tells of a tunnel collapse that happened just after sunrise in the 19th century. Farmer feeding his goats noticed that the earth at the edge of his field had sagged. By noon the hole had widened into a crater. Beneath it was the collapsed ceiling of a Khanat shaft, one of the oldest in the region. The tunnel had gone without maintenance for 5 years, too long. No one had descended into it. No one remembered how. After the collapse, the nearby neighborhood lost water entirely. The government offered no help. Locals tried to dig out the entrance but couldn't navigate the twisted, caved-in passage. Eventually, the shaft was bricked, up and forgotten. A small almond tree now grows on the spot. It blooms for a few days in March, then wilts. No one waters it. And still, the rest of the city walks above dozens of functioning Khanats, most of them built over 1,000 years ago. Quietly, persistently, but not eternally, echoes in other lands' Persian Khanates didn't remain confined to Iran. As the Achaemenid Empire stretched westward, the technology spread with it. In Syria, they became known as Falaj. In North Africa, the Berbers called them Foggorers. And in Andalusia, Muslim engineers expanded Khanats into urban centers, designing whole neighborhoods around their gentle, silent streams. One of the most famous is the Alhambra in Granada, where delicate water channels fed baths, gardens, and fountains, all sourced from miles away in the hills, guided underground by gravity and Persian design. But even here, the story turned sour with time. After the Christian reconquest, the knowledge of how to maintain these systems faded. Though the fountains continued to flow for centuries, they eventually became decorative rather than functional. Their sources were replaced with modern aqueducts. The tunnels beneath them were sealed or collapsed. It's easy to forget a Khanat. It hides itself too well. The ghost map. There's an old map, dusty, sun-faded, stored in a provincial archive in eastern Iran. It shows a city not as streets and buildings, but as dots. Each dot marks a shaft. Each line connects one to the next. The city above may have changed a dozen times. Different rulers, revolts, markets, schools. But the city beneath, the one of dots and tunnels, remained mostly the same for 1,000 years, until it didn't. The back of the map, someone once wrote in faded ink, "To forget the tunnels is to forget the water," and yet cities do forget, always. So here's the quiet question. When the last person who understands a Qanat dies, does the tunnel die, too? Or does the water keep flowing just out of reach, just beneath our feet, waiting for someone to remember? You're walking beside an old man. His hands are scarred and leathered, the nails black with mineral crust. His turban is faded. His sandals whisper across the gravel path. In the crook of one elbow, he carries a coil of hemp rope. In the other, a worn brass water gauge passed down from his father and his father's father before him. This is Master Habib. He is one of the last true Mukanis, a keeper of forgotten tunnels, a whisperer to underground rivers. He does not use machines. He does not consult digital surveys. He walks the land, listens to the wind, tastes the dust, and when he says water is near, it usually is. But even Habib will tell you, the craft is dying. The apprenticeship of silence. Habib once had 3 apprentices. The first left after 2 years to become a truck driver. The second lost interest after a near-death cave-in. The third, Omar, a quiet young man with long eyelashes and a habit of sketching, stayed. Omar was not like the others. He wasn't strong, nor brave, nor particularly interested in wealth. But he watched. He listened. He traced the underground maps with his fingers and could recite the depths of every mother well within 20 kilometers of Yazd. He was the kind of apprentice Habib had waited for all his life. Their days were spent in silence. In Qanat work you do not speak more than necessary. Noise travels. Dust clouds the air. If one person kicks a stone loose, the whole team might be buried. So the 2 men communicated with glances, nods, and touches of fingertips. They restored. A collapsed tunnel over 7 months, never once needing to raise their voices. But on the 8th month, disaster struck. The flood. From below, most people think of deserts as dry. But the earth beneath them moves with water. One spring, after an unusually wet winter in the Elburz Mountains, the groundwater table surged. The Qanats, built to flow with precision, began to overflow. In the tunnel near Kerman, where Habib and Omar were working, the surge came without warning. Habib was halfway down the shaft. Omar had gone ahead. Suddenly, a rush of freezing water filled the passage from the rear. Habib yelled, a short, sharp sound, and began to climb. But the tunnel was slick. His hands slipped. He dropped his gauge. It vanished into the black. Omar heard the rush. He turned, saw the old man fall, and scrambled back. Against the weight of water, against panic, against gravity, he dove. They were both pulled from the shaft 2 hours later, alive. Barely. Omar had broken 3 ribs and lost a tooth. Habib had shattered his right ankle. Neither could work for months, and in that long silence while they lay on mats in the shade, sipping goat broth and whispering stories, the truth became clear. Habib would not descend another shaft, but Omar would. Writing the unwritten, traditionally, the knowledge of Mukanis was passed orally. You learned by doing. You memorized the sounds. You traced the maps in dust. You watched a master tie knots with his eyes closed, or feel the soil with a fingertip and say, "This is too brittle. Wait 3 days." But Omar did something few Mukanis had ever dared. He began to write it down, not just notes, not just sketches. He built full diagrams, marked slopes in degrees, drew cross-sections of shafts, labeled mineral layers, calculated seasonal shifts in groundwater pressure, and he wrote quietly, without fanfare, because he knew that history does not applaud boring men with ink-stained hands. He was not trying to be remembered. He was trying to remember for others. A tunnel for the future. The last tunnel Omar worked on was never meant to carry water. It lay on the outskirts of a dry village, called canals. Once it had been fed by a small qanat. That qanat had collapsed in 1927. The people left. The village was buried in sand, but Omar had found the old shaft. He and 2 young assistants, children really, spent 4 years mapping, clearing and stabilizing it. They rebuilt the bricks, installed solar lights, marked every slope, and when they finished, they left the tunnel empty, not dry, just unused. It was not meant to flow, it was meant to teach. The children of nearby towns began to visit. Teachers brought them in small groups. Omar would guide them with a walking stick and a kerosene lamp. He would show them the air shafts, the curves of the slope, the silence of the stone. He would let them touch the walls and say, this was water. This was survival. In a classroom without books, he taught the art of listening to the ground. When a civilization breathes out, qanats are more than technology, they are memory. They represent a way of life where survival depended not on dominance, but on harmony. Not on conquest, but on patience. You could not force a qanat to give water. You had to wait a line, dig slowly. You had to accept the pace of geology and gravity, and when you succeeded, the water came quietly. Not as a gush, not as a roar, but as a whisper, a cool ribbon through stone bending past your ankles. To stand in a functioning qanat is to feel the breath of a civilization that never shouted. It simply breathed. And then the lights go out. Omar died in his sleep at age 47, heart failure, they said. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet ending. His notebooks were wrapped in cotton and stored in a clay jar, per his request, deep within the teaching tunnel near Canals. They have no titles, just rows of numbers, diagrams, soil notes, and the occasional phrase in Persian script, slope. Too steep, water may outrun breath. Avoid digging before dawn. Ground is still dreaming. Remember, the qanat doesn't bring water, it brings time. The villagers sealed the entrance after his death, out of respect, out of fear that no one else would understand the silence. But the tunnel is still there, still cool, still dry, still waiting. Reflection in the end, Persian air conditioning wasn't just a matter of wind towers and evaporative trickery. It was part of a larger philosophy, a way of channeling nature's rhythms instead of resisting them. It teaches us something unexpected, that the most advanced civilizations are often the ones that move quietly, that sustainability can be boring, that engineering can look like patience, that sometimes the most profound cooling system is the one that doesn't hum or buzz or shine, but waits in the dark, centuries old, beneath your feet. So if you ever visit Yazd, or Kerman, or the dry hills of central Iran, stop for a moment, feel the air, listen for the wind, and wonder beneath the dust. You're walking through the back streets of Yazd, the sun pinned high above like an unblinking eye, and the walls around you rise tall and beige and silent. You don't hear birdsong. You don't hear cars. You barely hear your own footsteps. All you feel is heat, and then something strange, a breeze, cool, dry. It moves past your face like the sigh of a cave. And when you look up, you see it. A tall, tower-like structure jutting from the rooftops. A brick spire with open slats on all 4 sides. You've just passed beneath a badgir, a Persian windcatcher. These towers aren't decorative. They aren't minarets. They don't house bells or smoke. They're ancient climate machines designed not to shout but to whisper the desert into submission. But how did this idea begin? And why does Yazd have more windcatchers than almost any city in the world? To answer that, you must go back nearly 1,000 years. The city of stillness Yazd has always been thirsty. Built on a dry plain between the Dasht-e-Kavir and the Dasht-e-Lut deserts, the city stands where other cities should not. Summer temperatures often reach 40 to 45 degrees C, 104 to 113 degrees C, and rainfall is scarce, sometimes less than 100 millimeters per year. In such places, most civilizations disappear, but Yazd adapted. Instead of fighting nature, its architects folded it into the walls. Streets were made narrow to trap shade. Buildings were made of adobe, which absorbed heat by day and released it at night. Courtyards were lowered below street level to find cooler soil. But the most astonishing innovation was vertical. The windcatcher. How to catch a breath. At first glance, a badger looks like a chimney. But it works in the opposite direction. Where a chimney pulls hot air up and out, a badger pulls cool air down. It does this through an elegant combination of principles that any desert dweller would find familiar, even if they didn't know. The physics. Wind pressure. When air blows across the opening of the tower, it creates a pressure differential. Air is pulled down into the building, bringing cooler outside air indoors. Air stratification. Hot air rises, cool air sinks. The badger is tall enough to allow warm air to escape through upper vents, while cooler air remains closer to the living spaces. Evaporative cooling. Often, a badger would direct air over a pool of water in the basement, called a house. As the air passed over the water, it lost heat through evaporation, further cooling the interior. Stack effect. On windless days, the sun heats the tower itself, creating a natural updraft that draws hot air out of the building and allows cooler air to flow in from shaded courtyards or underground canals. This isn't just a trick of architecture. It's a breathing system, one that doesn't rely on electricity, one that needs no moving parts, one that works as long as the sun shines and the wind moves, and it was developed long before the term climate control existed. The forgotten engineers, most badgers, were not designed by men with parchment and ink. They were shaped by craftsmen, bricklayers, masons and windwatchers, men who didn't read blueprints but knew every seasonal wind by name. In Yazd, there are over 3,000 windcatchers, some stretching over 30 feet high. They are not identical. Each is tuned to its neighborhood, its block, its exact place on the compass. Some are four-sided to catch wind from any direction. Others are one-sided, facing the dominant summer breeze. Some have internal vanes that guide air like the rudders of ships. Others are paired with subterranean canals, using the pressure of cool underground air to boost their efficiency, and every one of them had to be adjusted, sometimes yearly. Bricks were repositioned. Openings were narrowed or widened. Some households even hung wet cloths over the vents to increase evaporation. Imagine it, a city not just built, but tuned like an instrument, not by planners, but by people who listened to the wind. The rooftop. Language. You can tell a lot about a family by its windcatcher. In Yazd's old neighborhoods, children could identify their friends' houses not by the color of the door, but by the shape of the rooftop tower. Some were square and stubby, like thumbs. Others were elegant and thin with carved brick lace. Some were plain, others bore decorative tiles. In wealthier homes, windcatchers were paired with summer rooms, chambers buried partway underground with thick walls, where air from the badger would pass through a shallow pool before filling the room. The air in these chambers could be 15 to 20 degrees cooler than the air outside. In poorer homes, the windcatcher might only cool a small sitting room or a storage area for perishable foods. But even the humblest towers served a purpose. In Yazd, they say, no house breathes alone. When the wind dies, and then came modernity. After 1950, with the arrival of electricity and air conditioners, the bad gears fell into disuse. People plastered over their bases. Some were torn down entirely. Others were left to crumble. The ancient breath of the city slowed, and yet not entirely. In the 1990s, with energy costs rising and interest in sustainable architecture growing, architects began to look again at Yazd's rooftops. What they saw was astonishing. Buildings cooled passively. Streets shaded intelligently. Towers that didn't require wires, fans, or compressors. They began to study the ratios, tower height to room volume, opening size to wind speed, and found the math still worked. And so some new homes in Yazd, and even buildings in Dubai, Egypt, and Arizona, began incorporating neo-badgers. Some were made of steel and glass. Others mimicked the old bricks, but the idea remained the same. Let the building breathe, a cooling philosophy. The windcatchers of Yazd aren't just about survival. They're about restraint. They remind us that the best solutions often require less, not more. That you don't always need to conquer the environment. Sometimes you just need to open a window in the right place. They ask us questions modern life rarely does. What if comfort came slowly? What if we adapted ourselves to the rhythms of nature, instead of forcing nature to match ours? What if architecture could whisper instead of buzz? And perhaps the quietest question of all, what else have we forgotten to feel, simply because the air no longer moves through brick? So you've walked beneath the windcatcher. You felt its breath against your cheek. And perhaps for a moment you thought that was all there was to it. An old tower shaped by clever hands, stealing a breeze from the desert sky. But what you didn't see was what lay beneath, because the genius of Persian cooling wasn't just about catching the wind, it was also about where to send it. Windcatchers, in their most sophisticated form, weren't standalone inventions. They were part of a complex thermal ecosystem, a series of ancient design decisions layered like geological strata, descending deep into the earth. And the most important layer of all? A tunnel in the dark. A slow-moving underground river. A kanat. Diyai. Water beneath the city, imagine. Digging horizontally into the side of a dry mountain, carefully guiding a slope so shallow it's nearly invisible to the eye. Now imagine doing it by hand, over miles. That's what Persian engineers did, more than 2,500 years ago. The kanat system was one of the most quietly revolutionary engineering feats of the ancient world. It allowed cities like Yazd, Kerman, and even far-flung desert outposts to access fresh groundwater without the need for pumps or aqueducts. Each kanat began in the mother well high in the foothills. From there, a gently sloping tunnel would carry water down, relying solely on gravity until it reached the city. Along the way, vertical shafts were dug, spaced roughly every 20 to 30 meters, to provide ventilation, remove spoil, and offer access for repairs. The result? An underground cool-flowing artery that not only provided water but created a deep, moist channel of air, perfect for cooling, and that's where the windcatcher came back into play. The earth as refrigerator. When a badger was connected to a kanat, it didn't just pull in the wind, it created a thermal loop. Here's how it worked. On windless or hot days, the air above the city stagnated. But underground, the kanat tunnel remained cool and moist. often hovering around 16–20 degrees C, 60–68 degrees, even in summer. By positioning the Badger's intake side to face away from the wind, it created a low-pressure vacuum. Hot air in the building would rise, be drawn into the tower and escape. As it left, cooler air from the qanat would be pulled upward through basement channels, filling the rooms with a gentle, chilled draft. In wealthier homes, these tunnels connected to a sardab, a traditional Persian summer room. A sardab was more than just a basement. It was a calculated space, low ceilings, thick adobe walls, and often a small pool or fountain in the center. The air from the qanat passed over this water, undergoing evaporative cooling before entering the living quarters. This wasn't just clever. It was repeatable, scalable, and silent. Centuries before electricity, how the light was blocked, but cooling air wasn't enough. In the desert, light is heat. So Persian architects learned to manage not just airflow, but daylight itself. The homes of Yazd were designed with deep eaves, small windows, and recessed courtyards. Glass was rare and heat-absorbing. Instead, wooden latticework, called panjara, was used, often with thick shutters behind it. Walls were thick, sometimes half a meter, made from mud bricks mixed with straw, which had surprisingly high thermal resistance. These walls absorbed the sun's heat slowly and released it back during the night, smoothing the swings in temperature. And then there were colors. Most buildings in Yazd were finished in light brown or pale yellow plaster, designed not for beauty, but to reflect rather than absorb the sun's punishing gaze. To the modern eye, it all looked similar, but to those who lived there, every corner was calculated. Every choice, material, placement, height, was part of a quiet language of survival, a language now nearly lost. Listening to the house in traditional Yazdi homes, comfort wasn't a switch you flipped, it was a balance you maintained. Every morning, the house would be opened at exactly the right hour to let in the breeze. Then windows and vents were shut again before the sun reached its peak. Families adjusted cloth screens, watered courtyard tiles to increase evaporation, and sometimes sprinkled rose water on walls or fabrics, not just for scent, but to cool the air further as it dried. They didn't cool the house. They cooled spaces within it. A sitting room for midday rest, a cellar for food storage, a shaded porch for evening tea. Each space had its own temperature profile, and families moved between them like planets around a sun, closer or farther depending on the heat. Compare that to today's constant thermostat setting. Which truly understands comfort? The engineers with no blueprints, the builders of these systems, left few written manuals. Much of their knowledge was oral, passed from master to apprentice, father to son. The shape of a dome, the length of a shaft, the curve of a tunnel. These were felt, not calculated. A famous qanat master could sometimes walk over dry land, pause and say, "Dig here." He knew by the shape of the hill, the soil underfoot. The smell of the breeze, that was science too, just older, and yet this forgotten expertise cooled entire cities. While Rome relied on aqueducts and later Europe on stoves and chimneys, the Persians had already found a way to tame wind, water, and sun without moving parts. Climate control. Before wires today, the modern world depends on air conditioners. Compressors hum on rooftops, fans spin behind walls, freon seeps through coils. And the cost? Gigawatts of energy, tons of emissions. But in Yazd, for 1,000 years, families cooled their homes without burning fuel or mining lithium, and they didn't even think of it as advanced. It was just what you did because the land was harsh, and you had to live with it, not against it. So they built into the earth, they built up to the wind, and they made homes that responded, day by day, to the natural rhythms of the desert. They created adaptive architecture long before the term existed, and yet many of these systems are now endangered. As concrete replaces adobe and glass towers rise above the skyline, windcatchers are being sealed or torn down. Sardabs are used for storage, not living. Canals are filled or polluted or blocked by construction. It's not that people forgot how to build them, it's that people stopped believing they mattered. But what if they do? What if, in the age of climate crisis, we've dismissed the one idea we need most? That cooling a building doesn't require a motor. That shade isn't a luxury, it's strategy. That listening to the wind might be smarter than trying to overpower it. And what if all of that knowledge is still here, hidden beneath the plaster, in the silence of a tunnel waiting to be breathed back to life? You're standing beneath a badger again. But now something has changed. You've seen beneath the surface, felt the shadow of canals winding through the earth, tasted the cool stillness of sardabs, and watched the interplay of mud, wind, water, and time shape a world where comfort didn't come from control, but from accommodation. Now you're no longer asking, what is this tower? Now you're asking, why did we stop listening to it? From empire to erosion, the city of Yazd, the quiet jewel of this narrative, has stood since the time of the Median Empire. That's over 2,500 years of architectural inheritance, passed forward like a whispered secret. But time, as always, began to erase the finer edges of that wisdom. By the late 19th century, as European influences reached Iran through trade and diplomacy, Western building techniques were introduced to cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and eventually Yazd. Plaster began to replace mud. Straight lines replaced curves. Metal pipes began running water above ground, and Western-style homes, rectangular, glass-laden, symmetrical, rose beside old adobe domes. To many city leaders, these new buildings looked modern. They looked European, and to a generation raised on the values of modernization, that was the future. A future with electric fans and glass windows. Badges began to vanish from the blueprints. In some cases, they were left standing, but only as decoration. Like a statue to an ancestor no one visited, and yet they were still there, in the background, breathing, until they were silenced for good. The age of air conditioning. In the mid-20th century, like many places across the globe, Iran adopted a new idea of thermal comfort, the air conditioner. The logic was simple. If the desert is hot, build a machine that makes the inside cold. And for a while, it worked. The cool air was reliable, predictable, controllable. You didn't have to think about wind directions or current humidity. You just flicked a switch, but that convenience came with a cost. Air conditioners require power, and lots of it. In a city like Yazd, built on passive cooling principles, AC units weren't just a shift in technology. They were a philosophical rejection of centuries of local knowledge. They introduced sealed interiors, flat roofs, black asphalt roads that trapped heat instead of reflecting it. By the 1980s, some new neighborhoods in Yazd were 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warmer than their older counterparts. The windcatchers stood nearby, still functional, but ignored, because modernity had moved on, breathing life into clay, but not everyone forgot. In the early 2000s, a quiet movement began, a mix of architects, climate scientists, and preservationists who started looking again at windcatchers. not as relics, but as models. They began asking, what would happen if we reintroduced them, not as decorative domes, but as functional systems? One of the most striking examples came from Yazd University, where students rebuilt a full-scale working badger using traditional materials, sun-dried bricks, clay mortar, wooden louvers. The results? High 10°C reduction in interior temperatures without a single watt of electricity. No fans, no refrigerants, just air, earth and geometry. More projects followed. A few modern homes incorporated hybrid cooling systems, badgers that worked alongside, small solar-powered fans. Others dug shallow Qanat-inspired air tunnels beneath new eco-buildings, and in 2017, UNESCO declared the historic core of Yazd a World Heritage Site, recognizing its ingenious use of limited resources for survival in the desert. The badgers were no longer outdated. They were an answer. The modern windcatcher now, architects in Dubai, Cairo, and even California are experimenting with neo-badgers, towers inspired by the Persian originals, adapted for modern materials, and urban layouts. Some are angular, steel-framed, with embedded sensors to open or close vents based on humidity. Others mimic the original design almost exactly, complete with internal shafts and evaporative cooling basins, only now paired with automated louvers and AI-driven airflow management. Even tech campuses have taken notice. A facility in India recently integrated badger-style passive cooling into a zero-energy office complex. Another in Arizona explored using Qanat-inspired underground tubes to pre-cool incoming air during peak heat. And slowly, the world is rediscovering something ancient, that we don't always need more power. Sometimes we just need to let the building breathe, preserving the invisible. But preservation isn't easy. Many old badgers have collapsed or been walled off. The artisans who once knew how to align bricks for perfect airflow are aging. The skills to maintain qanats are becoming rarer. In some Iranian schools, workshops are now being offered to train a new generation in these disappearing techniques. Children who once stared up at the towers in confusion are now learning how to map wind direction, how to calculate thermal differentials, how to use Adobe, not just because it's traditional, but because it works. And with climate change intensifying across the globe, creating longer, hotter summers, this ancient architecture is becoming relevant again, not just for Yazd, but for all of us. What it feels like inside, you may be wondering. What's it like to actually live in one of these homes? Imagine a small room tucked beneath a thick mud brick arch. The light is dim, filtered through patterned lattice. You sit on a cotton mat beside a shallow pool, its surface still. Above you, the shaft of the badger hums faintly, like a sleeping throat, and then a breeze, not harsh, not cold, but deliberate. It passes over your skin like someone blowing gently across the back of your neck. It carries the faint smell of earth, stone, and moisture. Outside, the sun pounds on rooftops. But in here you rest, no noise, no compressor, just the sound of water shifting somewhere in the depths of the house. This is what cooling used to mean, not command, but cooperation, breathing lessons. There's a Persian proverb that says, "When the earth is tired, the sky must breathe for it." That's what the badger was, a way for the sky to breathe into the earth. When heat pushed down, the windcatcher lifted it away. When buildings grew stale, the qanat offered freshness. When comfort became rare, the home answered gently, without wires or alarms or flickering bulbs. And maybe that's what we've forgotten. That buildings aren't just boxes to shelter. As they're instruments, they play with air, light, shadow, moisture, and in the best cases they help us live with the world, not against it. A future in the past, as cities today struggle with energy, emissions and climate resilience. Some are looking forward, but maybe the smarter ones are also looking back to Yazd, to the Badgir, to the whispering Qanat, to a time when the wind itself was a tool, not an enemy. The silent windcatchers are still there. Some crumble, some stand proud, some wait beneath dust and wire for someone, maybe you, to look up again and wonder, what would it take to build? One not just out of bricks, but out of respect for what was once known and could be again. You are standing at the edge of the Zagros Mountains, where the land seems to heave and collapse in slow motion. Steep ridges folded like discarded parchment, valleys that plunge downward into shadow, and distant plateaus blanched by the heat of an unforgiving sun. But beneath your feet something moves, not quickly, not with noise, but it moves. You might never hear it, you might never even feel it, but the water is there, cool, ancient, and impossibly patient, flowing quietly beneath the surface as it has for over 2,000 years. This is the story of the Qanat. But more than that, it is the story of the people who built them. The people who, without blueprints or pumps or satellite maps, learned how to listen to the earth and draw life from desert. Let's begin. A problem of water in. Much of Iran, rainfall is rare, especially across the arid central plateau, which stretches from Yazd in the north to Kerman in the south and westward to the Zagros foothills. This wasn't a problem for nomads. They moved with the seasons, followed pastures, drank from springs while they lasted. But for settled agricultural communities, towns that grew wheat, barley, and pomegranates, reliable water wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Wells were the first answer. You dug straight down, pulled water up in buckets, but wells had problems. They dried quickly. They served only small communities. And lifting water, especially deep water, required a great deal of labor, animal or human. Worse, surface evaporation meant every drop exposed to the sun vanished before it reached the field. And so, sometime around 1000 BCE, perhaps earlier, engineers of the early Median and Achaemenid periods began to dream of a better system. Instead of drawing water up, they would guide it down. The birth of the Qanat begins with a spring, or more often, an underground aquifer fed by distant mountain snowmelt. This water isn't pressurized, it doesn't surge, but it moves slowly, beneath layers of gravel and stone far from the reach of the sun. The goal of the Qanat builder was to tap into this underground stream, without draining it, and without letting the water touch daylight until it reached the village far below. To do this, they devised one of the most ingenious hydrological systems in ancient engineering. They dug a sloping tunnel from the aquifer down to the settlement, often stretching for miles, but tunneling underground blindly is impossible. You'd suffocate, you'd lose direction, you'd collapse. So they created a rhythm of vertical shafts, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, dug at regular intervals along the planned route of the tunnel. These vertical shafts served three purposes: ventilation, so the workers underground could breathe; access, so debris could be lifted out without reversing; alignment, so the slope could be measured and adjusted. When viewed from above, the result looked like a line of puncture marks, little pits marching across a desert landscape. But underground it was a miracle. A gently sloped tunnel about 1 meter high, allowing cool, Clean water to flow by gravity alone from its hidden source to the town. The builders, mukanis. The men who built these tunnels were known as mukanis. Their work was brutal, dangerous, lonely, and yet it was respected in a way few other labors were, because the mukani wasn't just a digger. He was a geologist, a mathematician, a hydrologist, a draftsman, and above all, a man of instinct. There were no modern instruments, no GPS, no sonar. Instead, mukanis learned to read the land the way a sailor reads the sea. They noticed where plants grew even when the surface was dry. They studied where ancient animals had gathered in shade. They tasted the wind. They watched the night air for dew. Then they listened, the tapping of a foot on packed earth, the smell of the dust, the sound of stone layers when struck. With these subtle cues, they determined where water ran deep below, and then, often without hesitation, they began to dig. Some tunnels ran just a few hundred meters, others stretched nearly 100 kilometers. It could take years to complete a single qanat. Some teams lived in tents for entire seasons, walking every day to the newest shaft, descending into darkness, chiseling rock with hand tools, clearing sand, measuring the gradient with small bowls of water and intuition. Many died underground. A mist stone, a flash flood. Hay cave in, but still they dug, because every completed qanat gave life, sometimes for centuries, a system that never stops. The finished qanat didn't require maintenance every week or even every month. Its power came from simplicity. Water flowed. At a slow, steady rate, it emerged cool around 12-15 degrees into a juba or open channel, which meandered through gardens, homes, and public washing areas before dispersing into fields. Unlike canals or wells, qanats didn't flood. They didn't evaporate. They didn't require fuel or beasts. A single qanat could irrigate dozens of acres, feed thousands of people, and supply entire urban neighborhoods. Some were linked into networks, with master canals branching into smaller ones. Others were capped with sardabs, underground rooms cooled by the water flowing past. The oldest known working qanat in Iran is still flowing, over 2,700 years since it was dug. In fact, in some towns, when the taps are turned on today, the water they receive comes not from a municipal treatment plant, but from a stone tunnel carved by men who never knew what a faucet was. When the qanat became sacred, it's easy to think of the qanat as merely functional, but for many communities the water that emerged from the mouth of the tunnel, called the mother well, was considered almost holy. In Zoroastrian culture, water was a sacred element, and the act of revealing it from the hidden earth was an act of purification. The builder of a qanat, therefore, wasn't just a technician. He was a servant of light, bringing something hidden, silent, and life-giving out of darkness. Ceremonies were sometimes held at the opening of new qanats. Incense burned, prayers were spoken, and often the first cup of water drawn from a new qanat wasn't used for drinking, but poured gently back into the earth in thanks. Tension with the surface, but the relationship between qanats and the towns they fed wasn't always harmonious, because a qanat never stops. It flows in winter when less is needed. It flows in drought, when every drop is precious. It flows whether the people have planned their use wisely, or not at all. This meant the people had to adapt to the system, not the other way around. Fields were watered on a rotating schedule, set by elders or water officials. Disputes over irrigation times could lead to feuds. Children learned early not to bathe or pollute the canals, because in a town fed by Qanat, misuse was disaster. And yet over time a kind of rhythm emerged, a culture of quiet respect. A memory passed through generations, not written in scrolls but in routines and habits and whispered instructions. You wake early, not because the rooster crowed or a bell rang, but because the air in your stone house has warmed slightly. You open the small wooden shutter and feel it, the faintest breeze, no cooler than your own breath, drifting across your skin. But when you step outside and follow the narrow, shaded path that curves behind the orchard, you find it, the Juba, the low, stone-cut channel through which a stream of cold water glides silently past gardens and dust. This is the lifeblood of the village. It flows as it has for generations, and it comes from somewhere invisible, somewhere underground. Today, you will follow it backward, to understand where it begins, and to understand why, of all the forgotten marvels of the ancient world, this one still works. Digging with precision a Qanat may seem miraculous, but it's no mystery. Every inch was designed with quiet precision, though most of it was never written down. The most important element was slope. The gradient had to be just enough to allow water to flow gently downward, without stagnating or rushing so fast that it eroded the tunnel. Ancient mechanics calculated this by hand using simple tools, weighted plumb lines, straight sticks, water bowls. The average gradient? About 1 meter per kilometer. That's a slope of just 0.1% too steep, and the tunnel collapsed. Too shallow, and the water never reached the surface. Then came alignment. Without compasses or satellite images, how did they dig a straight tunnel for dozens of kilometers? The answer was in the vertical shafts. Each shaft, spaced about 20 to 30 meters apart, was carefully placed using ropes, pacing, and triangulation with visible landmarks. Workers would dig from the mother well downward and also from the valley upward, using sight lines and chalk marks to align the routes. If they were off by even a few degrees, the tunnels wouldn't meet. The water would be lost, the labor of years wasted, and yet in Qanat after Qanat they met, often with an error of only a few centimeters. No one called it genius. It was simply what you did if you wanted to bring water to your people. Maintenance. The art of listening. Once built, a Qanat was not a thing to abandon. It needed watching. Silt accumulated. Tree roots intruded. Collapses happened slowly and invisibly, and so each village had caretakers, often descendants of the original Mukanis, who made it their duty to monitor the Qanat. They'd climb down the shafts, torch in hand, barefoot, sometimes with a canary to test air quality. They'd crawl the narrow passageways, clearing debris, checking slope, repairing leaks with stone or clay. Every few years, depending on region, the entire tunnel was cleaned, and in some towns there were annual festivals, not to celebrate water, but to pause its flow. For one day the canals ran dry. The people inspected the beds, repaired their curves, and offered food to those who served the underground river. It was a form of seasonal gratitude and an act of self-preservation, because if the Qanat died, so did the village. Architecture of the earth. You might think the Qanat ended at the Juba, where the water spilled into view. But in many towns, the Qanat's water was invited into the very architecture of life. Take the Badgir, the Persian wind tower. These structures rose like chimney spires above homes and cisterns, with slotted windows on all four sides. As wind entered, it was directed downward into the building, where it passed over water from the Qanat stored in an underground chamber. The result? Evaporative cooling. It wasn't air conditioning as we know it, but it dropped indoor temperatures by 10, sometimes 15 degrees, enough to preserve food, store documents, and let families sleep without drowning in sweat. Some houses even had 2 chambers, one dry, one damp, one to store grain, one to keep cheese. The air moved between them, regulated by vents, doors, and clever angles. The Qanat water was also used to fill sardabs, cool cellars where food was fermented, wine was stored, and meetings were held on the hottest days. In Yazd, in Kashan, in Bam, you can still find buildings like this, empty now sometimes, crumbling. But when you step inside, the air is still cooler, still haunted by the breath of water that once passed quietly beneath its floor. Women and the water in. Many villages, women managed the flow of water within the home. Before sunrise, they rose to collect it, carrying ceramic jugs or wooden pails to the stone channel, dipping them in with practiced grace, balancing them on hips or shoulders as they returned. Water was needed for cooking, for washing, for tea, for infants, for prayer. Each family had a time slot, 15 minutes, 30, longer if they owned fields. Women passed this knowledge to daughters, how to judge a clean flow, how to strain grit, how to keep the jug cool with damp cloth. In some areas, women managed communal laundries near the jubeh. These were shaded spaces with benches and smooth stones, where clothing was scrubbed with ash and rinsed in Qanat water. It wasn't just utility, it was rhythm. A rhythm of stone and silence and water flowing beneath your hands. Conflict and custom, of course. Not everything was peaceful. Qanats, for all their simplicity, were at the heart of water rights, and disputes over them could be intense. If one village dug a Qanat too deep, it might intercept the water table of another. If a rich landowner diverted too much water, the poor would suffer. So communities developed detailed customary laws. Who got water when? How long a field could be irrigated? How far a tree must be from a jubeh? How many liters could be drawn during drought? These rules weren't enforced by police, but by memory, reputation, and the quiet authority of elders. In one village, it was said that the oldest man drank first on New Year's Day. In another, children were taught to apologize to the water if they spilled it. And across much of Iran, a silent gesture became universal. If you saw someone carrying a water jug, you moved aside, because even if you had no water of your own, you knew what it cost to carry it. When modernity forgot in the mid-20th century, the world changed. Electric. Pumps became common. Deep wells replaced tunnels. Cities grew. Cars came, and the Qanat, slow, invisible, eternal, was forgotten. Governments dug massive irrigation canals. Developers built over ancient shafts. Wells drained aquifers faster than they could refill. Some Qanats dried, others collapsed. By the 1980s, over 75% of Iran's active Qanats had fallen silent, and yet not all. In the villages that still remembered, families preserved the names of the Muqannis. Children were still taught the sound of clean water. Festivals were still held in the shadow of bad gears, and in some corners of the world, Peru, Morocco, Afghanistan, systems like the Qanat endured under different names, because some technologies are too perfect to die. They are simply forgotten, waiting to be remembered. But the question remains, what does a village do when the water beneath their feet disappears? You wake again, not to the cool hush of a pre-dawn breeze, but to something missing. The jubeh is silent. You press your ear near the stone edge where water once trickled, and there is no sound. Not a splash, not a murmur. Only a hollow dryness, as though the ground has forgotten its voice, And in this stillness you begin to understand what was once taken for granted. That underground water, as abundant as it may seem, is never infinite. It must be tended, like a garden. And when forgotten, it leaves not with a roar but with a whisper. The collapse of patience. When electric pumps arrived in the 20th century, they were hailed as miracles. No more digging long, delicate canals through rock and clay. No more waiting years for the mother well to fill the first trickle. You could drill a borehole in weeks, attach a diesel engine and pull water straight to the surface. It felt modern, efficient, civilized, but there was a cost, and it was quiet at first. Electric pumps could draw water faster than any canal. Too fast. And because deep wells bypassed the slow recharge of aquifers, the water table began to drop. Not by inches over centuries, as it once had, but by meters in a few decades. Canals, those shallow sloped tunnels, depended on a stable water table. When it fell below their lowest point, they went dry. Even if the tunnel remained intact, even if every shaft still opened cleanly to the sky, the water no longer reached the village. And so, one by one, they failed. A network of more than 50,000 canals in Iran alone began to collapse, both physically and culturally. Some tunnels were blocked by sediment, never to be reopened. Others were sealed for safety. Some villages relocated entirely, leaving behind orchards, homes, and centuries of routine. The patience that had sustained the system had been replaced by urgency. But the desert does not respond well to urgency. The cities that forgot. As Tehran swelled from a quiet city into a metropolis of millions, it consumed more water than any canal could deliver. Developers paved over jubes and badgirs. High-rise apartments replaced shaded courtyards. Air conditioners buzzed in glass windows. Few remembered that beneath the asphalt lay the bones of old canals, and in the rush to build, the old shafts were often forgotten, until they weren't. The 1990s, several sinkholes opened in Tehran, some in backyards, others in busy streets. Investigators traced them to collapsed canal shafts, long neglected. Their wooden reinforcements rotted away. Urban planners called them ground failure events, but in villages they were called something else, a reminder that water remembers. Where it once flowed, and it does not always leave quietly. The last Mukhanis, not all hope vanished. In the province of Yazd, one of the driest inhabited places on earth, a few families never stopped maintaining their canals. Their ancestors had passed the knowledge through generations, how to align a tunnel by stars and shadow, how to estimate slope by feel, how to taste the mineral content of fresh seepage and know whether the aquifer was changing. By the late 20th century, only a few true Mukhanis remained. Some were in their 70s, some in their 90s. When they spoke, it was in quiet, exacting phrases, not for storytelling, but for teaching. Young. People listened, some reluctantly, some with curiosity, but always with a growing awareness that the pumps might not last forever. When oil prices rose, when fuel ran short, when a well ran dry for good, then and only then did the village turn back to the slope in the earth and ask, could we dig again? Revival underground. By the early 21st century, awareness had shifted. Water tables in many countries, including Iran, had dropped to alarming levels. Lakes shrank, crops failed, sandstorms grew more frequent, and suddenly the canal was no longer an artifact. It was a solution. In UNESCO meetings and climate research forums, the canal, once dismissed as a relic, was praised for its sustainability, its zero-energy operation, its community-based management. Pilot programs began. Engineers and archaeologists collaborated. In places like Syria, Morocco, and Afghanistan, similar systems called karez or falaj were mapped and, in some cases, restored. In Yazd, the Zarch Kanat, the longest in the world at over 70 kilometers, still flows. Parts of it have been repaired with modern tools. Others are maintained by hand, exactly as they were 2,000 years ago. Visitors are guided down shafts. School children are taught how slope works. Cities begin to realize that air conditioning can be learned not just from machines, but from stone, water and patience. Lessons in humility. What do the Khanats teach us? Perhaps first, that not all technology is meant to be replaced. Some is meant to be remembered. A Khanat is not fast. It is not glamorous. You do not see it. You do not plug it in. You do not photograph it for tourists, but you trust it. Because it was built not for a king, not for a season, not for display, but for the survival of villages, for the rhythm of planting and sleep and milk and breath. Because it required coordination across generations, where one grandfather dug the mother well and a grandson might one day clear its shaft. And because it works with the earth, not against it. When you forget to honor water, it disappears. But when you learn to listen, it speaks again, and sometimes it even sings. So the next time you walk a quiet alley, and the air seems cooler than it should be, ask yourself, what flows beneath your feet that you do not see? What other knowledge lies buried, just waiting to be remembered? Good night.